Attorney General.
But a political party, it's like
political party.
That's all I want. Okay, Mark, thanks very much. I'll hear from you shortly. Right. Good morning. I know it sounds crazy, but it's almost impossible to escape the conclusion that Premier Bennett and his government were headed for an election prior to Expo, until the roof fell in. The conflicts of interest, the embarrassing, sorely embarrassing behavior of two of his cabinet ministers, and who knows what the private social credit polls have shown. Now, yesterday we have this, somebody call it shuffling the seats on the deck of the Titanic, the cabinet shuffle. Bunch of new boys in different ministries now. That won't make life any easier for Premier Bennett. But, you know, he has another crisis. Yesterday he makes his education announcement. The money is going to be spent and allocated by the cabinet. And you begin to wonder whatever became of the legislature, because the government runs out of money officially on March the 31st, unless the legislature is called and a budget is passed. But on the other hand, the moment you drop an election writ, you can spend all you want by special warrant. This is all up in the air still as far as I'm concerned. Now we're going to look at the moves in education to refinance some of its sufferings through the eyes of Mark Rose, the NDP education critic. That's one thing for this morning. And then we're going to meet a brand new Attorney General, not ours, from Ontario. He's been in office since May last year, and he is Ian Scott, the Ontario Attorney General. And I want to nag him about why he's not doing his duty to keep these Ontario people wanted on warrants away from Granville Mall. And I want to ask him how they do the conflict of interest guidelines in Ontario. For a bit of international relief, not light relief, we're going to look at the problems of terrorism. And Steve Wyatt has prepared a little backgrounder on this problem.
The Italian cruise ship, the Achille Lauro. On October 7, 1985, it is sailing to Port Said when it is commandeered by terrorists. They demand the release of Palestinian prisoners being held in Israel. They hold the ship for 2 days. One American is killed. November 23, 1985, an Egyptian airliner en route from Athens to Cairo was hijacked and forced down on Malta. The terrorists carry out systematic executions. By the time Egyptian commandos have stormed the plane, 59 people are killed, including 2 Canadians. December 27, 1985, simultaneous attacks at Rome and in Vienna. It is a bloodbath, leaving 19 people dead, 5 of them Americans. The target appears to be the ticket counters of the Israeli airline El Al. The leader behind the attacks is believed to be Abu Nidal. He heads a breakaway group from the PLO. He will say in an Arab newspaper later that his terrorist attacks are very legitimate. And later he claims to have been in the United States when, in his own words, President Reagan was asking for my head. He also claims to have avoided recognition through plastic surgery. Nidal is closely allied with Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, whom he calls a brother, a great help, and a loyal man. The whereabouts of Abu Nidal are still a mystery.
And here to talk about that is Dr. Allan Cunningham from SFU, an expert in knowledge about international terrorism. It won't be light relief at the end of the program, but I want you to watch this girl sitting at a typewriter, and then I'll tell you who she is. She is Leanne Barker, who is the CanAM arm wrestling champion. And before I turn to Mark Rose, let me give you a little bulletin. Mayor Mike Harcourt of Vancouver announced 3.5 minutes ago that he is going to run for the NDP in Vancouver Centre in the vacancy caused by the retirement from politics of Gary Locke. Now, I don't know what that means about the NDP leadership in due course, but first we're going to tackle Mark Rose on the education financing policies of social credit after the break. Hold on a second, Mark, while I check with Mark Schneider, this is Mark Rose, NDP, on what Harcourt is going to do precisely. Mark?
Jack, I think you know by now that Mayor Michael Harcourt this morning formally declared his intention to seek the nomination for Vancouver Centre. I asked him point blank whether he intends on resigning his position as Mayor of Vancouver in order to seek that nomination. He said absolutely not. He'll have to wait for the social credit government to declare an election for the province. And he says it's totally unthinkable that there would be an election between now and until Expo is over with all the dignitaries and the royal family here. So he's obviously banking on a fall election, I would assume, because then the nominations come up for municipal elections in the fall. So he'll be high and dry if nothing happens.
Fair enough. And it's Vancouver. He announced Vancouver Centre, did he?
That's right. It's been a fairly safe NDP seat. Of course, we know that Gary Locke has said that he would not be running again, so he'll be stepping into that position.
Thanks, Mark. Now to Mark Rose. You're not surprised, of course, by Harcourt's announcement, and he's a very strong candidate for the NDP in Vancouver.
I'm very pleased. I think that it'll be a remarkably, compliment to our party to have him being a candidate.
Let's get down to education. Many educational people are relieved, to say the least, that Premier Bennett came out with his $110 million grant in the first of a 3-year program for centres of excellence, and he's going to kick in $90 million to bolster the reduced school board budgets, right? That's good.
That's what he said. Of course. So you don't shoot Santa Claus, do you?
Right. Now, what's wrong with it? That's what you're here to tell me.
Well, for one thing, it's a complete reversal of the policies of the last 4 years, where he's taking systematically over $300 million out of the education system. So it's a complete repudiation of his policies, and he's promised in his speech to do everything just the opposite to what he was doing for the past 3 years. So it's a remarkable conversion.
How is this money going to be allocated?
Well, we don't know for certain. You know, we hear about excellence, we hear about art and music and consultations and all this stuff, but it seems to me that it's going to be allocated mainly by a decision upon application by various districts and colleges and universities, but the money, the grants, will be based on a cabinet decision, which is wonderful, really, isn't it, when you think of it?
Well, don't be sardonic about it. What do you mean it's wonderful? Many people think that's wonderful.
Well, you know, satire is always a difficult thing, isn't it?
Especially on television.
It's very difficult on television. No, I think that what it does give is an opportunity for candidates and ministers and members in various ridings to have lots of photo opportunities and grant allocations and that kind of thing, ribbon cuttings for this various things. And it's more a larger example or an extended example of their trend towards centralization. In other words, the local school district doesn't really make the decisions about the spending any more than it does about budgets anymore.
Didn't the Premier say yesterday that he was going to the Cabinet would make these grants on a basis of merit? Does that mean merit of the kind of grant sought, whether or not it's ESL, Asian languages, computer centres, centres of excellence, whatever these are?
Well, what he's saying essentially is that the grants are going to be made on the basis of a decision made in Victoria by the Cabinet. I, as a spokesperson for my party, believe that the best decisions are made locally. That's why we have school boards. That's why we had elected college boards until 2 years ago, so that the local community could decide on what was best needed for their district, not some bureaucrat or some remote cabinet minister somewhere in the Department of Education or somewhere else.
All right, give me an assessment of Hewitt as the new education minister, because Heinrich has gone.
Well, how can you assess somebody that hasn't had anything to do with education? It's too early to say. All I know is that obviously Heinrich has been tarnished in the sense that he has no credibility with the educational community any longer. He's had 3 years of ad hocery and cutbacks to the extent of, as I said, over $300 million. They got to get a new face. When Van der Zalm became sort of lacking in credibility, they got Smith. And when Smith was made Attorney General, they got Heinrich. And so each time, what the government is saying essentially is, look, forget about that bad guy we had here before. We got a new guy, and he'll be nice to you. But the fact is that there's no point in talking to the monkey. The organ grinder, who's the premier, in my view, is the one that should have been shuffled.
Now, he said yesterday, of course, there'll be considerable consultation with everybody involved in the system, and that must please the teachers.
Except that they weren't among the people listed in his speech yesterday that he intended to consult with. They were deliberately left out, I think, but maybe that's because he has systematically scapegoated teachers for 3 or 4 years now. I think it's an attitude among the people who were in social credit towards education. Many of them have been very successful financially without very much formal education. I don't think they have much appreciation.
Is that a snobbish remark?
Not at all. They have been very successful according to their lights.
And they don't have much appreciation of the benefits of higher education? That is a snobbish remark.
Is it?
Yes.
Well, I refuse to take it back.
You won't apologize?
No, I won't.
But, you know, one of the reasons they may have acted is because your left-wing bedfellows, Cope, you know, they swept the Vancouver School Board elections. That must have given Premier Bennett considerable jolt.
Well, I went through some, I didn't list them, but I said he reversed himself on all kinds of things. He cut the colleges, now he's going to retrain skilled young British Columbians. He cut the college budgets without warning. He cut the university budgets without warning. Do you know, Jack, that a young person in BC has about half the chance towards going on to post-secondary education than, say, one from Ontario?
Shame. Mark Rose is going to tell us next the kind of magic wand the NDP would wave to make everything perfect in the province in education and take your calls too. Just here for one more segment. He'll take your calls too after the break. To paraphrase W.A.C. Bennett, you're a carping critic on the outside and you have no solutions yourself, and you can't have because of the downturn in revenues in British Columbia.
Well, if the revenues are there to throw $200 million at education at the next 2 years. We've got $3 billion for Site C. We've got all kinds of money for Expo to lose $3 million. 300 million bucks. Then I would assume that the government must know where the money is, and they know where the bodies are buried. And if that revenue is available to Mr. Bennett, surely they would be equally available to Mr. Skelly.
Go ahead. Just a minute. Go ahead, please.
Well, I think that maybe you've answered my question, but I still think that it's easy to point fingers at all the different programs that the government has and find little places where you can draw money from. Where would you get the money to finance all these programs?
I would get the money the same place that the Bennett government gets the money. And besides, if I were involved in a government, I would be part of a cabinet, and there would be priorities, and the whole thing would have to be examined. But we don't have access to the total books. You know, it's very obscure, the kind of money, even the money we owe. All we know is that despite of restraint, the provincial budget has gone up year after year, and so has our debt.
Your priorities would be different. You'd go for education before what? Before industrial development?
I think you need a mix. I think the province needs a mix between mega and micro projects and job-producing projects for the municipalities. But I don't think, that you can say one thing or the other.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
I basically wanted to comment that I have to agree that the recent cabinet shuffle should have included the premier. I thought that was an excellent comment. I don't know where they're finding this money all of a sudden to throw at highways and education that they didn't have 2 months ago.
It's easy enough to knock the highways, Mark, but that Coquihalla construction and the extra $118 million does give a lot of jobs, even if it's borrowed money.
Sure, but there are other things that give jobs too. A mega project costs you $1 million a job. A municipal job costs about $25,000 to $50,000. You get a lot more bang from your bucks on the local scene, but you need a mix. CPR was a mega project.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I wanted to ask a question to Mr. Rose about the BC Government Employees Union. How would the NDP handle the position that the Government Employees Union is taking right now, and what would the NDP...
Labour negotiations. You know that, Scott, at the moment the government has said no increase for 2 years and a small increase in the third year and a little bit after. He's up against it financially, isn't he?
Well, he seems to have lots of money for certain things.
But he is up
He's got
against
lots of
it
money for
financially.
education as long as teachers don't get any of it. You
Yeah.
know, and I think that's all a result of polling, too, and same with the government employees. If you scapegoat people long enough, you know, you're going to have a public reaction against them. But I think you have to have upfront, free, collective bargaining.
There is a slight suggestion that there should be a separate university for advanced technology or something. And Mr. McGeer is keeping communications and science, but Fraser has got universities. Do you think there's
And colleges.
any danger of that?
And any danger of what? Having a separate institution?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there was a big article in the paper yesterday about the government's or McGeer's edifice complex. In other words, he wants to take things away from the existing universities and build a super university with a lot of high-priced help. And this is, while at the same time has been cutting university budgets.
You don't like it?
I think it needs to be examined. I don't like it on the surface of things.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack. Good morning, Mr. Rose.
Morning.
Mr. Rose, I'd just like your opinion on appointing Jim Nielsen, a man who can't handle his own personal affairs, to handle the personal affairs of 200,000 people on welfare in this province. Thank you.
Well, I think that I'm reluctant to make any comment on certain improprieties that have been embarrassing both to the government and Mr. Nielsen.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack. I think Bennett is getting away from this because getting away with these things because NDP has never ever offered any solutions, as Jack has suggested earlier. You've never ever told you're letting yourself be held in ransom by labor and the unions, and Bennett knows this, and he can make all kinds of mistakes because the public is afraid. You know, you don't have an alternative. You never had.
There's a certain measure of truth in what he says. You blew it when you were in power for 3 short years.
I happened to be down in Ottawa at the time, so you don't lay that one on me.
Right.
But I will say this, that there is a perception there that people have to be reassured, people have to have confidence in us that we'll be prudent and sensible and not shovel money off the back of a truck with a scoop shovel. And I think we have to build that confidence because I think we do have alternatives. Just look at the comparison between the people who have gone into poverty in BC since Bennett has been in the 80s, up 65%. In Manitoba, an NDP government, up 1%.
We've lost 31 million hours in the past 2 years in the lumber industry of highly paid jobs. Past 3 years.
I want to tell you something
hours.
else. 2,000 people a quarter in '85, every 3 months, have voted with their feet. They've left British Columbia to seek opportunities elsewhere.
Go ahead, please, from Nanaimo.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to find out what kind of money is going to be allotted for the kids who do not do so well in school. You know, the ones who don't have the minds for the technology, for the computers, that sort of thing. This seems to be where the government is heading right now, which is great for some people. But what about the kids who are just going to end up being truck drivers and you know, that sort of thing? Also, I'd like to find out if Mr. Rose has any comments on the BCGEU, and there's not going to be any more money, you know, pay increases. My husband is an FAW for the Ministry of Human Resources, and he's low man on the totem pole. For the kind of work that he does, he's the person that all the people on welfare cry to because there's not enough money for them.
Let me put this. I don't think you can tackle that one again.
There's too many.
We tackled that a moment ago. But how severely, in your position as the NDP critic, did the social credit policies, have they damaged the educational system, especially with the one-on-one and the additional aids and teaching helps and all the rest of it?
Well, that's the tragedy of it all. It's those kids who are either extremely gifted or those people who have extreme difficulties that have been, I think, have been victims of the kind of savagery which has cut educational spending by 25% in the last 3 years. Well, and no institution can stand that. Learning assistants have been fired. Various kinds of assessment procedures have been fired. Classes have been larger, so kids that have been mainstreamed into the, you know, kids that have some handicaps and learning difficulties are into larger classes, so teachers don't have time to spend with them. And I think they're the tragic victims of this whole system.
So despite the cabinet shuffle and the appointment of Hewitt from Consumer and Corporate Affairs to be Education Minister and the $200 million, your sum up is what?
Cosmetic.
My thanks to Mark Rose. Next, out of British Columbia to prosperous Ontario, with Ian Scott, the Attorney General of that magnificently economically healthy province. After the break. Nobody was more shaken and surprised than the Liberal Party of Ontario when they won the election last May under Mr. Peterson. And here is the Attorney General. Were you ever in the House before, sir?
Never been in the House before, Jack.
First job in politics and you go to the Cabinet as Attorney General?
First job. And they tell me down east that until I've been savaged on this show, I'm not a real politician. So here I am.
Just not true. Nobody gets savaged on this show anymore.
Well, let's go.
But why do you allow your police departments who issue warrants for people wanted by your courts, and when our police pick them up in Granville Mall, you know, two-bit drug pushes, druggers, drug traffics and whatnot, they are non-returnable warrants. You deliberately, would seem, put out these fugitive warrants but don't supply the money for the people to be brought back to your jurisdiction.
No, we issue the warrants. They're Canada-wide. Some of them are for offenses involving $300 or so. It costs us $2,000, $3,000 to bring them back. If you people will pay to send them back, we'll be glad to prosecute them in Ontario.
Is that not a complete dereliction of duty on your part?
Not at all. It's you know, most of the offenses are minor. Nobody out here would pay $2,000 or $3,000 to get someone back for a $300 charge. Besides, many of them come from out here and they're only coming home.
Now, let me get that again. Your attitude just appalls me. You're telling me that you put out a Canada-wide warrant for a guy wanted on a charge in which the penalty might be $300.
Right.
And you say, as long as you get out of the province, just forget your warrant.
We say no such thing. If they're in the province, we'll charge them. Well, they are charged. We'll prosecute them, take them to trial. But if they exercise their right and leave the province or go home, we will bring them back if it's worthwhile to do so. But it isn't worthwhile to spend $2,000 or $3,000 of our taxpayers' money to bring them back. Now, if you're not happy to have them here, if you'd like to give us the $2,000 or $3,000, we'll take them back.
This is what is called a Canada-wide warrant, providing the people who find them pay the fare to get them back into Ontario.
The taxpayers of our province aren't going to solve your problems. We have enough of our own.
So it's not justice that matters, it's money.
Of course it's justice that matters, but justice has to be considered in terms of cost.
You mean good economical justice?
Well, there's a problem here.
Good cheap price justice.
There's a problem here, and if you people will offer to pay, we'll offer to prosecute them.
But I'm told that we always pay the return trips of our fugitives who might be picked up in Ontario.
That's what they're telling you?
Yeah.
I see.
You expressed some doubt about that. You
well, I haven't seen that demonstrated. I don't think there's any provincial government that is prepared to pay for a trivial offense, say $2,000 or $3,000 to bring a man back to be prosecuted. It's not economically sound. Our taxpayers would be very critical of us if we did that. Now, in serious cases, of course, we always bring them back and always will.
Well, at least you've laid it on the line. You're a new enough Attorney General that you're not afraid to give an answer yet. That'll come in due course, won't it?
How long do I have?
I give you another 6 months, and then you'll begin to equivocate and go around the houses. But let's talk about this dreadful problem on which I've campaigned for many years on the kiddie hookers. Have you found a way? As you know, C-49 does not really deal with underage prostitutes from 12 to 14 or 15 or 16. Have you found a way whereby you can get them off the streets and deal with them in some civilized, intelligent manner? Because we haven't.
Well, we haven't either, to be frank. I'm here because Mr. Crosby, the Attorney General of Canada, is having a conference on the criminal code, and we're very hopeful that he'll present today, during the discussion, some proposals that will deal with the pimps who supervise the activities of adolescent prostitutes, and who will deal with the customers of adolescent prostitutes and throw the book at them.
You have to amend the criminal code because some aspects of the criminal code already ban or punish sex with children of certain ages, but this is a more criminal one to get against the pimps, if possible, and those who are the customers of the
Exactly, and you know, it may be that criminal code amendments are required to do that, but in our city, in Toronto, and I'm certain in Vancouver, it's a major problem that has to be dealt with.
Are you happy with C-49? Has it cleared the streets of some of this social pest problem?
It's been a help, but it's not by any means the whole answer.
You didn't endorse that particular amendment?
Well, we endorsed it, but it doesn't go far enough.
Why can't we get to the stage without removing, I mean, we've all gone through this before. We know that prostitution per se is illegal.
Yes.
Is legal. Prostitution per se. Could we come to an area where instead if a woman operates by herself without a pimp in her own place, it should be legal?
That's being considered, and certainly if the woman is of the age of majority, an adult, and is not abused, that's a matter to be considered. But the problem here that is terribly frustrating has to do with youngsters and has to do with abuse, namely pimps. And I think the federal government has to take some strong action on that
But
subject.
it's a provincial responsibility. Once you've got this young, unfortunate young girl in your hands, it's your responsibility to look after her from a medical or social point of view.
Certainly, and there are programs in Ontario, both in the private sector and the public sector, that are beginning to deal with this problem. It's a social problem. It deals with maladjusted kids,
And the age of the
often middle-class
hookers
kids who've left home.
The age of hookers has dropped dramatically,
Yes.
I'm quite sure, in the past 20 years. Something else quite important. Have you run into the conflict of interest problem yet? And I'm sure you perhaps have, but what are your guidelines to ensure that there are no conflicts of interest for cabinet ministers?
Our guidelines are fairly tough. First of all, every cabinet minister or parliamentary assistant has to resign from any office or directorship he holds when he enters the cabinet. The second thing, he can't have any other job. The third thing, if he owns assets or shares in a business, he has to declare what those are, and if there's any risk that he will be dealing through those businesses with government, they have to be put in a blind trust so those assets are managed by an arm's-length trustee. And those rules apply not only to the assets of the cabinet minister, but to his spouse and minor children.
Spouse and minor children.
Yeah.
In other words, when you were elected and appointed to the cabinet,
I didn't own anything. That was my problem.
No. If you'd had anything, when your colleagues were elected, did they have to take the list of their assets to some registrar who said you can keep this, you can't keep that?
What they did was they took their list of assets to an independent official in the Attorney General's department. He prepared a public declaration of their assets, which was filed with the clerk of the legislature. And if those assets were likely to involve any dealings with government, like shares in a company or anything of that type, those shares had to be put in a blind trust, which means that he could have nothing to do with them during his term in office. They would be managed, sold, or what have you by a trustee, a trust company or some such, without any reference to him.
In other words, there's nothing wrong with whatever the man holds. The cabinet minister or the official can hold whatever he wishes when he enters cabinet.
Yes.
And at that time, as long as it's all put in a blind trust,
Yes.
even if he knows what it is, that's perfectly all right.
Sure, and if he has some cabinet knowledge, he is unable to communicate with the trustee, and so he can't take advantage of his cabinet knowledge. And of course, the trustee may sell his assets and buy others, and the cabinet minister won't know about that.
Is the trustee defined as a trust company?
No, it's not defined as a trust company, but the officer of the Attorney General's department who supervises the establishment of the trust requires that the trustee be independent, and it is usually a trust company.
Ian Scott, the Attorney General of Ontario. He's going to be here for one more segment. There might be some old Ontarians who want to know the job prospects back there, or whatever, because who knows what's going to happen there. And I have some more questions for Mr. Scott, too, after the break. Ian Scott is the Attorney General of Ontario. And you committed absolute sacrilege on the dignity, prestige, and esteem of the entire legal profession by wiping out, retroactively and for the future, the Appalachian Queen's Counsel. Am I correct?
You're correct. I even lost my own on the way.
Why did you do it?
Well, the problem was that we had a very large number of QCs in the province. Many people thought they represented some kind of excellence, and many of them did. We had some very fine lawyers who were QCs, but it simply got to be an insuperable problem. There were too many. We were being pressed on all sides to appoint more. There were no standards. The Law Society was unable to set up any criteria. So the Premier finally decided, well, we've had an end of this. Our government really isn't into the business of being importuned by lawyers or anybody else for designation. Now, I want to emphasize that a lot of very fine lawyers had the designation.
But I mean...
But they're going to remain fine lawyers.
See, you're beginning to equivocate already. You made the decision to wipe out QCs, and then you say, but a lot of very, very lawyers, we didn't mean to offend them or hurt them in any way, shape, or form. In fact, Mr. Attorney General, you wiped them out because they've been watered down and had become worthless tokens of political patronage.
Right. How's that?
You caused a lot of trouble out here, because you get a QC, you get a new gown, and you can charge more in your bills.
Well, you see, all the best lawyers are in Ontario, and when the Ontario lawyers don't have them, then nobody else in the rest of the country will want them.
I'm afraid these calls might be old home week. You're the first Ontario politician I've had on since Davis.
Yeah.
And that must have been...
Who?
A fella called Davis?
Oh, yes, I remember him.
He's an employee of Mulroney's at the moment.
That's right.
On acid rain. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Scott. Jack.
Good morning.
Prior to moving out to British Columbia in the 70s, I was a member with the Hamilton-Wentworth Regional Police Force. Oftentimes, we picked up people on the street that we could not even return as far as Toronto because the average warrant had a radius of return of 25 miles. And unless things have changed dramatically in the past 10 years, I can't see any police agency issuing that large a number of Canada-wide warrants. We were virtually forbidden to do such because of the prohibitive cost of returning.
Okay, I've got the point. Yeah. Do you put limits, mileage limits on your warrants?
There's a procedure that permits mileage limits, but the reality is that the warrant can easily be extended, and our problem is not extending the warrants. In the appropriate cases, they can easily be extended. Our problem is getting the money to bring minor offenders back.
Not worth the money.
Not worth the money.
Makes some sense. Thank you, ex-policeman. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to remark on this transportation of people from one province to the other. I was brought out here from Ontario last July on a breach of probation. They sent 2 sheriffs down to pick me up. 2 weeks later, I went into court in Vancouver here, and I was acquitted.
Well, now...
And that's one of 4 times that they have come and got me, all pertaining to...
well, I don't know if it's bad or good, but if they came to you for 4 times, it must have been a reason they were after you. Was it a...
Well, the charge was originally fraud, but the last time they brought me back was a breach of probation.
And so that was a waste of money, you'd say, because you were acquitted?
Why, sure.
Okay, bye. Don't think we can get into the details of that.
No.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Morning.
I wanted to talk about the deal that happened in the paper in the last few days that just came to our knowledge about the gentleman being beat up quite severely by the police downtown.
I'm not censoring you. I'm going to say my own piece on that tomorrow. I haven't had a chance to go through the documents yet, but I can put this question. When you have allegations of police brutality in Ontario, and God knows you had many in the Don jail, how are these charges investigated? By the police themselves?
Well, in Ontario, in metropolitan Toronto, Jack, we've set up what is called the Police Complaints Commission. Actually, to their credit, it was set up by the previous government. And what that does is it supervises the police investigation of these charges. And if, according to the commission, which is headed by a judge, the investigation or its result is inadequate, then the commission itself conducts an investigation or a hearing.
Well, we have much the same here. But
and it's working very well in Toronto. It's working so well that we're giving consideration to extending it to other parts of the province.
Won't involve you in this, but we had a shocking case here, documented now and all the rest of it, where there were a number of policemen present during this undoubted event, but nobody could remember anything. And if it had been a policeman beaten up by 5 or 3 or 4 or 5, we would have had all kinds of evidence. It was a cover-up. And I don't know how you guard against cover-up unless you always put a civilian in to supervise police investigations of brutality.
Well, you can't guard against cover-up, but what you learn very quickly is that a cover-up that involves 4 or 5 or 6 people simply doesn't, over the long exercise, hold. And if you have a proper investigative procedure, as Watergate and a whole variety of incidents have shown, those cover-ups break down. The importance is to have some kind of independent investigation, and that's what we try to have in Ontario.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
It's regarding the Canada-wide warrant.
Yes?
I came out to BC 8 years ago, and 3 years ago I applied for a job where I had to be bonded.
and discovered that I had a kind of wide warrant as an accusation had been made as the day I had left Ontario. Now, we went through the normal channels with lawyers, and all the charges and accusations had been sorted out. But the kind of wide warrant still stands. I've checked this with the local police, and they won't drop this until the person who made the accusation goes back to the police and states that he made a false accusation. Now, I had explained to the police as well, and through the lawyers agreed with us. There was no sense in me going back to
Ontario? What happened to him? What happened to him?
Maybe he's gone back to Ontario.
They're checked out before these warrants are issued.
Well, that may have been an injustice in your case, but we can't decide that at this time of the event, can we? I don't want to talk any more about Canada-wide warrants. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. In regards to prostitution, what we should do is make it an illegal act, like they have in Holland. Everybody uses Amsterdam as an example, but the fact is they only put up with the idea of prostitution. And number two is that in regards to Canada-wide warrants, we have military aircraft flying every day from Vancouver to Toronto to Montreal. Most of the times they are either quarter filled or half filled, and we could put these people on there and save the taxpayer a lot of money.
Practical?
I don't think that's practical, and I don't think making prostitution as an act illegal is practical. It's one of the things that has been with us since the beginning of history, and really what we have to do is to see that it isn't abused in the sense that pimps and young people don't get embroiled in it.
One final question. How long will this double-bed relationship last with Bob Rae between the Liberals and the NDP in Ontario?
Who told you? Bob Rae isn't in our bed. What we did was we set out what our program was that we campaigned on. It had some 20 items, and he agreed to support it. And we don't know when he'll withdraw his support. That's up to him. We're carrying on as if we were elected to be a majority government. We're trying to be as effective as we can, but we're not in bed with the NDP.
They're just sleeping at the foot of the bed.
Well, they're in the house, but they're not in the bedroom.
My thanks to Ian Scott, the Attorney General. Mr. Scott was at one time counsel to Tom Berger in the famous Berger inquiry.
Right.
And Ian Waddell.
Ian Waddell.
My thanks to Ian Scott. He's a very nice guy for the moment, but who knows how he'll be 2 or 3 years down the road. My thanks to Ian Scott. Next, we're going to talk about terrorism after the break. I was thinking this summer of making a trip to the Middle East via Rome and Athens, and I've suddenly decided not to, for obvious reasons. Here is Dr. Allan Cunningham, who's an SFU history professor and made a considerable study on international terrorism. Am I being chickened by saying to myself, Dr. Cunningham, that I'm going to stay away from Europe in case I get hijacked in an aircraft?
Yeah, I think you should worry instead in case you get knocked down by a truck in the traffic in Rome. Probably.
Much graver danger.
Much graver danger.
But what I'm telling you is that all of a sudden, I'm never nervous flying in my life before, I'm now beginning to become nervous because of the effects of terrorism. What are the answers, if any, to the kind of terrorism we're facing today?
Well, if you mean at the airport, if you've looked at the Indian court conclusion on the sad episode that started at Vancouver Airport, they obviously indicate that you could cut down very seriously the risks of getting on the wrong airplane. And Vancouver came out very badly in that court post-mortem.
That really is not, that's a kind of obvious sanction, but what about dealing with terrorists? Who are the principal offenders in dealing or not dealing with the problem of state or non-state terrorism?
Just to depress you about your prospects of traveling, I would think that the chances of you actually heading it off, if people are determined enough, are very small. In other words, taking action against an aircraft is fairly easy. The standard solution for the moment in Europe is that the person complete with baggage is escorted at every stage onto the aircraft. This is temporary. You work out a way around that. I was at a conference just a few weeks ago in Europe on this sort of topic, and people were talking very freely about something which is quite old now, and this is the capacity for several people to penetrate a border, an examination screen, anything else, and then put together the various components they've carried separately and assemble a device, a bomb, whatever else, whenever they arrive at their destination. And if, of course, they're the sort of people who don't mind getting killed themselves, they'll assemble it before they get to the destination and they'll disappear with the airplane if it blows up. You cannot.
There is no, in fact,
there is no solution up to the moment, and this came out very clearly at this conference I was at, where, for instance, amongst other things, one person started to talk about backpack nuclear weapons. So you no longer think of a thing that's in a projectile 30 feet high. You now think of something which can be miniaturized to such a degree that you can have something catastrophically taken through the normal channels of air travel.
Do we face that danger now?
Mm. So when Gaddafi says, if President Reagan does this or that, the consequences within the United States will be very serious, it has to be the case that Americans know this is true. Americans in a position to know. Because indeed it is easy. The great undefended border is right with us. The number of people passing through that border from Canada to the other side has increased enormously of late. And of course this is interpreted to mean that amongst the people crossing that border are people who are intending to be naughty.
In that case, therefore, perhaps we should just accept our fate to that extent, in that international terrorism by determined individuals cannot be avoided beyond all reasonable precautions, correct?
At the moment, there are very few really comprehensive answers to it.
But now we've got the situation in Libya, you know, the base allegedly for Abu Nidal. How does one handle that unless there's kind of cooperation between the major powers of the world, in the Soviet Union, the United States and Western Europe?
Well, they won't collaborate because the Soviet Union is so often charged with being the heartland of international terrorism, when in fact, if you look at it, virtually every major capital is itself both victim of terrorism and perpetrator of it at one and the same time. So it's hard luck on the civilian population, but the governments of communities who feel victimized are very often involved themselves. You know, in the United States, for instance, terrorism is privatized, like all forms of business. It's private enterprise. You can go if you want and spend your vacation taking a course. You can go to a place like, Dolomite, Alabama. Take yourself a course with an outfit called CMA, Civilian Military Assistance. They'll teach you how to defuse bombs, how to carry out attacks, how to face police interrogation and survive it. And these are the people who trained the two men we're looking for in connection with the Air India disaster. So it's business. And it's business actually against American law, but nobody stops it.
Funny how we never think of that. I always think of Gaddafi's Libya as being the place where they train the IRA or the Palestinians or whatnot, and you would tell me that the balance of evil on our side is just as bad as any evil on the other side.
It is just as extensive, and if you want to look at who plays these games, the United States obviously trains people to go into Nicaragua. Israel trains people in Guatemala. Mrs. Thatcher doesn't think that this sort of thing happens perhaps domestically within her country, but at the level of state terrorism, Mrs. Thatcher doesn't mind destroying the Belgrano when it's away on a journey from the scene of action.
You're not suggesting that the destruction of the Belgrano was in fact a terrorism plotted by the British state?
It is a violation of rules of war, and to that extent it was indeed, and this is the whole gist of the attack on her in Parliament by the people who won't give this one up.
I realise that. I realise that it was headed the other way and somebody made a decision contrary to
So what we're saying is that terrorism, if this means a violation of the normal rules of behaviour, even war has some rules of behaviour. None of them are very nice, but you can even violate these if you're bad enough.
And I suppose you could throw in the way the British have behaved on occasions in Northern Ireland in the questioning of prisoners, or is that not terrorism?
Well, the scale of terrorism, I think, can go from destroying the Belgrano to a football match.
Well, the other day, though, of course, right, when we had these Reagan economic sanctions against Libya, are they a farce?
Yes, sure they're a farce. Because his economy has already been destroyed by the last 4 years of not sanctions against him, but the withdrawal of investment and so forth. The Americans who are in the country will go home, obey Mr. Reagan's legislation, and then they'll get a ticket and go straight back. And many have done this. Some have come back in obedience and have gone back already. The economy is flat, more through his inability to sell his oil than anything else. He was making 22 billion a year just 5 years ago. He's making about 9 at the moment. So the sanctions against him, which were informal, have worked. To talk about further sanctions is nonsensical because none of them are needed.
But they tell me that his own particular image among his own countrymen in Libya is pretty good, Gaddafi.
This has fluctuated a very great deal. The fact that he had to cancel the independence celebrations last September for the first time since he came to power suggests that he's afraid of people at home. And the man who probably carried this out was the governor of one of the provinces, the governor of Sirte, and he has disappeared. But the fact that he has to cancel what has been an annual celebration is a bit of an indicator here. The French have tried to assassinate him in the last few years. Another reminder that terrorism has many sources. He's got such a very good East German defensive situation and anti-terrorist group looking after him. These are enormously successful, able people, about 3,500, looking after him and his ministers.
They're East German trained?
Aye. They are East Germans.
3,500 East Germans.
Aye.
What with the Mossad and the CIA and the French intelligence service and the Brits?
And the CIA has just been put back into business by President Reagan. At the same time, when, hand on heart, he talks about the need to deal with international terrorism. The CIA was called out of Latin America by the Congress. He authorized it to go back in, giving it a separate budget, which is now called Aid for Peaceful Purposes, meaning medical supplies rather than weaponry for the Contras in Nicaragua.
Straight lie.
This kind of, well, it sure it is, because in fact I know the name of the man who sits next door to him in the executive building next to the State Department, next to the presidential office. And this man is there to get round Congress's prohibition. Here is an army officer who is now in charge of funneling the funds which Congress officially cut off to Nicaragua, and he funnels funds to the Contras.
Has Dr. Cunningham got no good news? Try again after the break, and we'll take some calls too. Will you? Price for the assassination of Abu Nidal, whether he was in Libya or not. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because he said we will search out and destroy.
They've put $250,000 on the heads of the 2 men who hijacked the TWA 847 flight. I think their problem is that they, like many other people, are not half so good at this kind of game as they think they are, so that if they look for Abu Nidal in Tunisia or Libya, they're wasting their time, because I can tell them the suburb of Damascus where he lives.
No.
Aye.
Now, what about this interception of aircraft and the American warplanes cutting across that bay? What do we know about that? How dangerous is that?
Well, it was thought to be very dangerous to the extent that the day that happened, President Reagan was doing something very exalted. He was talking to the workers at the Sara Lee bakery. And in the middle, he was intercepted by Weinberger with the information that the aircraft had taken off should they intercept it.
Going to Tunis?
Aye. And we have great details on the conversation between the two, because they were talking between 2 separate aircraft, the president going back from Sara Lee, Weinberger in an aircraft somewhere else. And in fact, the scrambler systems were not compatible between the 2 aircraft, so it came out in plain language, and their conversation was picked up by a ham radio operator in Chicago, who phoned the local newspaper and told them what he'd heard, hearing the president say, yes, let's go for it, let's force the aircraft down. The aircraft, as you know, was duly forced down in Sigonella, and deflected to Sicily, where we had that famous showdown where the Italians actually took them over, released Abbas against all American wishes, but then he was carrying a diplomatic passport. And the Italians rightly said, he has done no wrong in this country.
The Italians were right.
And whatever else, so they let him go and he went to Belgrade. And the Americans are now looking for him in South Yemen, where again, he probably isn't. But nevertheless, you see, here is this sort of instance where the pursuit of these people is much less resourceful than they themselves are in making their plans.
But what do you see ahead for the future? Just a continued deterioration of international relations exacerbated by terrorist activities?
Well, yes, because it's good business for many governments. They make a lot of money out of the supply of people we would call terrorists who, in the collective sense, are sometimes lumped together and called freedom fighters in the right situation. The money going into the Contras in Nicaragua is big money. The weaponry going in is big stuff. And if you multiply this many times over and think of the money, the weaponry sent all around the world, we are at one and the same time complaining of terrorism and we're feeding it. And incidentally, in this connection, our own country, which often tends to see itself as being rather pure, we are now the biggest per capita exporters of weaponry in the world.
Canada?
Yes.
But it says right here, Canada imposed measures limiting bilateral ties with Libya, and Mulroney made a strong statement in January against terrorism.
Well, he may have made the statement against terrorism. For Canada to cut her trade with Libya doesn't mean very much.
No.
It's pretty negligible.
But we are actually exporting small arms, I presume?
In all sorts of directions. But we are, in books like Jane's and so forth, we are the biggest per capita exporters of weaponry now anywhere.
How long till we have the backpack attack? Not we necessarily, but North America is as vulnerable as any part of the world, is it not?
Well, the United States would be regarded as extremely vulnerable because of the frontier. You can cross the frontier almost at any point you wish to. If we can judge by the ease with which people smuggle in cocaine and so forth, through yachts and boats, of course it's easy. Quite easy.
Let's take some calls. Go ahead, please.
Yes, question for your guest, Jack.
Dr. Cunningham here. Carry on.
Regarding the security, particularly in Vancouver Airport.
Right.
This is on a contract basis. And usually, nearly always, it's the lowest bidder that gets the job. And in my opinion, you get exactly what you pay for.
Did you lose the bid?
No, I didn't lose the bid.
Well, that's fair enough. That's not much in the way.
No, it's quite right, though. It's what the chap said when he was re-entering the atmosphere in Gemini 2. What were your thoughts as you re-entered? He said that this capsule was built by the people who put in the lowest bids.
Go ahead, please, from Whidbey Island.
Oh, good morning.
Morning.
You know, I was watching your program and listening to the American press and reading. There is such a control of the media reporting from the beginning with Menachem Begin's terrorism in Israel, and through when they downed the Libyan plane, commercial plane, and it came 1976, I think it was, with 167 passengers. Each time this kind of thing is buried in the media here.
You're speaking, of course, from Washington State.
Right. And right up to the dual loyalism and the recent spy business that developed in Washington with the Israelis.
Well,
they have a network of spies here, and there's a control of the media.
Okay. What do you think of the American press performance in reporting these things?
Over many years, the lady is obviously quite right. That there has been a skewing of information, but she's now dealing with something which has become epidemic and which once upon a time was perhaps more restricted. But she's right to the extent that if she wants to say who invented aerial hijacking, it's the Israelis. Who assassinated individual politicians? Well, this is as old as politics.
Yeah.
But it's quite true that the notion that Gaddafi somehow has invented a range of rather naughty methods of carrying out terrorist activities is just not true.
Question out of the blue. Did Churchill shoot down Tchaikovsky's plane?
Probably, yes. And had to go through with this because of the concealing of the sources of information.
More questions to Dr. Cunningham after the break.
Good morning, and a word about the stories we're working on for today's noon news hour. This is a day of politics. The new BC cabinet is meeting with half of the ministers either new or in new portfolios. The first announcement of money handed out by the new education minister. And in Vancouver, the mayor of Vancouver will run for a provincial seat, which leaves open the question of who's going to be the next mayor. Will it be Mr. Rankin or Mr. Campbell or Mr. Puel? We'll look into this. Join us at noon.
What's Gaddafi's nickname?
Al-Walad al-Majnoon, the crazy boy.
The crazy boy, Majnoon. I remember that one myself. And a Majnoon. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, you, sir.
I was wanting to know what are the possibilities of terrorism at Expo and what is being done about it. Also, what are we going to do about all the diseases that are coming to town?
All these?
All diseases?
Yes.
Oh, no more than normal, sir, the diseases. I don't think that's a valid question, all the diseases coming to town.
And if anyone knew about precautions for Expo, they certainly wouldn't be talking about them on the air.
No. But there'll be some need for some fairly
Of course.
stringent
Oh, of
security,
course, yeah.
especially when we've got VIP people here. Go ahead from Albany, Port Albany.
Yeah, this is a question for both of you, I guess, and I'd like your guest to comment particularly on it. Have you read or heard of the book None Dare Call It Conspiracy? And can your guest comment on the connection of the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, and David Rockefeller, and the fact that you never hear about them in the media, and the fact that the media has at the top of NBC, ABC, the New York Times, all members of the Trilateral Commission and Council on Foreign Relations?
I'll leave that entirely to you, Dr. Cunningham.
I know the book, and this has a very large supposititious content. What I would say is that one couldn't possibly be surprised if all the details in it were confirmed. As you probably know, it's very much based on the Italian model of the close conjunction of big business, men in governments, foundations with lots of money, and so forth. In North America, I think it's much more likely that the big money is with what we might call lunatic fringe organizations. And the biggest one of these, perhaps, is the World Anti-Communist League, which you may have heard of, and which is based in the Deep South. Now, this is one where the money gathers, the organizations gather, and they also independently train people to carry out what they would regard as acts of justice and patriotism, but which people on the other side, at least, would call acts of sabotage and terrorism.
But the governments are only involved in as much, I'm talking about any so-called worldwide conspiracy, where the members of the government are influenced, because governments in this country still have to be elected.
Yes, but this doesn't stop the person in a particular sort of office giving sanction to something which is private and informally organized, as long as this sanction is informal and it can be disclosed, but is ideally not disclosed.
At a less evil level, the British establishment, the old boy network, the people like Hess who thought they could come to Britain and make a deal in 1941. Go ahead, please. And there may have been people in Britain at that time who were prepared to make a deal in high places.
This is why very much there is the argument that the man was never to be released, because he would talk about the other people he had come to see.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack.
Yes.
I'd just like to say I think Dr. Cunningham is one of the best guests you've had for a long time. He speaks very forthrightly about something he clearly knows a great deal about, terrorism, and I'd be very interested to know of any literature or books he's written, or possibly any lectures he'll be doing in the Vancouver area. Thank you. I'll hang up now.
Dr. Cunningham is a professor of history at SFU. Do you give public lectures on these things, or do you hold classes on them?
Yeah, this sounds a bit like publicity, doesn't it?
That's fair enough.
Is it? Yeah, 3 lectures downtown coming up, I think, in March at the Robson Media Center on terrorism.
Good, thank you. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a question for Dr. Cunningham. There's something about terrorism that has always bothered me, never been able to understand it. Instead of the indiscriminate killing of innocent people that the terrorists seem to do now, why don't they try to nurture some international sympathy by knocking off people internationally who I can think of about 20 at least right now. The world would thank them for this, I think.
Yes, but
I'll hang up and listen to your thoughts on this.
This is a contradiction in terms, isn't it? because you are saying you disapprove of terrorism unless they kill the people you wouldn't mind seeing knocked off. This is why there's so much of it about, because we all disagree about who should be disappearing.
I know. And there are these dreadful American television programs where the goodies always whip into the country, kill everybody, wreck the place, capture the heroine and the doctor and come out again.
This has been said in a very interesting way recently, that when Arafat called Reagan a cowboy for intercepting the aircraft, that people said this was entirely the wrong thing for an outsider to say, because he didn't realize that to the American public generally, to be labeled a cowboy is not derogatory, because one thinks of Gene Autry in the films with his immaculately clean Stetson, or delivering what he once did in the film, giving the 10 commandments of the cowboy.
Yeah.
And these were not naughty commandments. They included look after the children while you're rustling the horses, and so forth.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Cunningham.
Yes,
sir.
Just wondering if Canada has anything equivalent to the British SAS in either its offensive or defensive capabilities?
Yes, it has. It's rather better concealed.
But it has, but it's better concealed. In other words, we're ready for any perceived emergency. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was just wondering about the doctor's education and what qualifications he's got.
I don't know what sort I'm supposed to have. I've been on the receiving end of terrorism. I'm familiar with people who have called themselves terrorists at different times, in the service of different causes. I have dealings with organizations in places like Britain, such as Scotland Yard, which attempt to deal with the problems which arise from terrorism.
And you made a pretty well lifetime you said you were in receipt of terrorism. That you had been involved?
Yes, I've been on the receiving end of it from time to time, and starting a long time ago when I was chased down the street by the Irgun and the Haganah, but the interest has gone to other places since then.
Interesting. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon. Or good morning. I have a question for your guest speaker. I was involved in counter-terrorism in Malaya and in Kenya. And is there any real separation at all between terrorism and counter-terrorism? The moral question comes up. In the end, what we were doing was exactly the same as what the terrorists were doing. The only difference, perhaps, is the political basis. And can you see any difference in justifications of political systems that cause that?
If you were in Malaya and Kenya, you have a good idea what the countermeasures were, as well as the initial terrorist acts. Is there any difference, Dr. Cunningham?
There is obviously supposed to be the difference that the one is sanctioned formally by a government, which is supposed not to drop below a certain level of international behavior, and the other is a law totally unto itself. But when you see the conflict between the two at close quarters, it's often very difficult to decide which of the two sides you would pick. In the Malaysia case, I presume you were there in Templar's time.
I was up in Anson Swamp.
Yeah, yes, enough said. And it raises this very problem that to deal with terrorism, if you resort to the same levels and resources and means, has terrorism brought you down as a government to its level of behavior, and therefore is there a distinction?
If they can do it without television, they can get away with it. I mean, the Americans in Vietnam were faced with television coverage all the time, whereas the Brits in Malaysia didn't have much in the way of reporting to the public back home. What did they?
There was a strange thing in Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta, who later became the political head of Kenya, was our enemy at that time, and at least his groups were our enemy. And there were very few. There were only 40 men that were sent in there in true counter-terrorist activities. There was 10 groups of 4 men apiece. And all of the guys that were in there during the Mau Mau crisis were all asked by Jomo Kenyatta when he took over power to come and train his police department, police force afterwards. I think that's sort of a compliment.
It is. Thank you, sir.
A compliment for your enemy to ask you to come and train his police force.
Thank you, sir. A fascinating mini lecture from Dr. Allan Cunningham, who will be giving 3 public lectures downtown in the Robson Square place in March, you say?
I think so.
Early in March. Much obliged. Now we're going to go to simple physical terrorism from the CanAM arm wrestling champion. Thank you very much, Doug. After the break. The other day I had a guru in here who showered me with angel dust. Today I have the CanAM lightweight world arm wrestling champion. Or what's to that effect? Leanne Barker and her husband are going to tell us what they actually do. Leanne, how old are you?
22.
How heavy are you?
135.
What's your sport?
Arm wrestling.
What titles do you hold?
2 North American and presently 3 Canadian American, a Canadian, about 4 Canadian titles, and a World Left Hand Championship.
And a left hand championship. Allan Barker, Leanne Barker, Allan Barker. Do you train, Leanne?
Yes, I do. I train with Leanne. I compete as well. But,
what are your titles?
Well, I was former North American champion and a couple Canadian titles, and I haven't competed for the last couple of years. I've just started back, so.
Tell me, what makes you want to be an arm wrestler? Who can tell me that? How did you get into arm wrestling, of all things?
Well, I used to do it with my father at home all the time, and then it went out into parties and at dances and whatnot. You'd arm wrestle, and eventually I ended up into an open tournament, and that's how I got started.
When did you start? How old were you?
I was about 16.
Now you're a weightlifter?
Yeah, well, bodybuilding.
Oh, bodybuilding?
Yes.
What can you lift?
Oh, we don't measure the weights.
Oh, you don't measure the weights?
No, that's a power lifter. But I started in school. I used to arm wrestle all the kids at school.
And beat everybody?
Yeah.
It's a knack. It's not a strength, is
well,
it? It's a knack.
It's strength plus you. Now it's becoming more of a technical.
Before, I'm not really going to try this. I'm going to go through the motions. Can you two demonstrate the holds with the way you're sitting now?
It'd be easier if she did it with you.
Wait till I take off my glasses in case she belts me. Okay. How do we do it?
You grip over the thumb.
Over the thumb.
You can grip over top of it if you want. You can grip either way.
You've got to get. I got to get out here.
Get your shoulders in.
There would normally be 2 elbow cups here that would.
2 elbow cups
that you would put your hands in, and there would be a peg over here that you would put your other hand on.
My hand on the other peg.
Yeah. Then you'd both be squared to the table
Squared
like this.
to the table.
The referee
You've
would.
got lovely blue eyes. Or is it blue eyeshadow? Both.
The referee would straighten your wrist.
Okay, straighten the wrist.
And then he would put his finger up here and he'd say, "Don't move. Ready, go."
How many times do you have to do this?
Just once.
It depends.
And then you get a double. You pin them on the pad here, and it's usually most of them are a double elimination.
Let's try left hand.
Come on.
But you're strong. I mean,
You're
This
strong
table is a
too.
little
my
bit too
tissues have
wide.
long melted. Okay, let's go.
Ready, go.
No, left hand's no good. That's funny. And I'm cheating.
Keep your elbow down.
Oh my God, that's really. Geez, how much pressure do you exert in that?
Well, you can. They do have tables where they have a spring, and they can tell you what poundages you're. A lot of times for men, average woman probably be about 150 to 200 pounds.
Where can we see you arm wrestle? I did it once in Yukon as a gag with a young girl. But you put on shows of arm wrestling.
Well, we do. Alan's the president of the BC Arm Wrestling
We just recently
Association.
held an amateur tournament at Richmond Center Mall, and we'll be holding more. We're going up on the island next month to hold one up there, and it looks like we probably have the CanAM this year over in Nanaimo.
Canadian American arm wrestling champion.
Right.
Right-handed and left-handed.
Right, just right hand.
Just right-handed.
We'll probably have 2 weight divisions for left hand, and we hope to hold the World Seniors over there at the same time. So maybe we'll get you over for that.
But the senior's only over 50, isn't it?
I think we start at 45, over 45.
Oh, well.
And then we have the World Masters, I believe, is at age 60.
60. I don't think I'll go in for it, because what actual exercises did you do to develop?
Well, we do overall training because the stronger your back or your stomach and your legs, it all adds into your arms too. But tendons play a big part in your strength. You got to have good
BC
tendons.
Amateur Weightlifting Association. What's that? Oh, Arm Wrestling Association.
Arm wrestling, yeah.
Great. That's us.
Have we got a phone number for it?
Yeah.
What is it?
525
525
0838.
Can you make any money at all?
Well, we have a big one coming up in Vegas, and this involves the new movie called Over the Top with Sylvester Stallone. And first prize there is $5,000 American, so that's, we can make some...
In other words, you're going to go down and play, you'll compete in the movie Over the Top with Sylvester Stallone.
Well, yeah, the World Championships will be held down there, so...
Oh, that's why it's been done, that's why he's filming the movie there.
Yeah.
And you should be in that.
Well,
hopefully,
yeah.
It'll depend on matches. They'll pick the matches that they want to use and so on like that. And I think what their idea is they're going to take all the first place winners in each division and put them into the movie, and then they'll use some of the matches from all the preliminary meets in the actual movie.
You have a good chance.
Yes.
You're the CanAM champion.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a good chance of starting in the movie as an arm wrestler.
Well, the ones that the tournament we were just in was in Reno, and it was probably one of the tougher stage tournaments ever held. And Allan took fourth in his weight class with 30 men, and I placed first in mine, and there was 15 women.
Do you wrestle with that ring on?
These are our wedding.
You have to have.
Yeah, we have to take them off.
You have to be completely bare from the elbow up.
Yeah. Short sleeves.
Show me your muscles.
No.
Come on, show me your muscles. Oh, yeah. They're not quite as big as his, but they're certainly bigger than mine. You're a delightful couple. I hope you star in the Sylvester Stallone movie. Next time you've got a function on, give me a call and I'll give you a plug on the air.
Okay.
Well, I don't know what it is about arm wrestling, but everybody likes to try it.
Well, we're trying to get the sport recognized. This is what this movie's trying to do, and get it out of the bars and get us recognized as real athletes, because we do train hard.
It's not in the Olympics yet.
No, they're trying to work it in there. You know, they're getting a committee together. So.
Well, thanks very much for coming in this morning. My left arm will never recover. No, it's fine. To Leanne Barker, Canada's female champion arm wrestler, Allan Barker, her husband and a champion arm wrestler in his own life. Watch for them in the Sylvester Stallone movie. They're both going to win and be in the movie, I'm sure.
Thank you.
And I'll be back after the break. We've got Ted Schellenberg, the MP for Nanaimo, Alberni, who's going to come over to talk about Action for Jobs tomorrow. And we'll have an interview with Perrin Beatty, the Solicitor General.